Michelle.
And I'm Lucy.
Welcome to another Cameo episode. These long-ish episodes will be slotted in between the other ones and will cover people who made a fleeting yet tantalizing appearance in other episodes.
Yes, he did.
Yes, he did.
Yes, he did.
We don't always have a lot of info about them, so they can't have a full episode of their own. That may not always be true.
No.
But they are too interesting to abandon completely, and they fill in gaps and enable us to create as full a picture of the era as we can.
And today, Sir John Fastolf.
Who kicked off the whole thing that just ruined the Paston family.
Well, it wasn't his fault. It was John Paston's fault, I think. Well, why have we chosen Sir John Fastolf for a cameo? I mean, he died before our self-imposed starting date. And he doesn't really have much to tell us about Henry VII's reign, except in as much as it is the history leading up to Henry's reign. We've mentioned him before. Definitely in Margaret Paston's episode, obviously. Mm-hmm. Also in Margaret Burgundy's episode, you mentioned him.
Yep.
And I'm sure there've been other times, but I couldn't quite place them. We do have a precedent for someone who died before 1485. We did 2 episodes on Mr. Tiptoft.
Yes.
And Margaret Paston herself.
Yes.
But most importantly, he was the inspiration for a character by a playwright that we will definitely be covering, since he was the original Falstaff from Shakespeare's Henry IV.
Right.
And the Merry Wives of Windsor. And he appears under his own name in Henry VI. And so I thought it'd be interesting to see whether Shakespeare was more fair to Fastolf than he was to Richard III or Macbeth. Mm. Also, there's a lot of information about him. We're very fortunate. He was a great letter writer, especially to the Pastons. He moved in quite literary circles in as much as people wrote to each other a lot.
Okay.
And so his friends have left plenty of evidence behind. And he was highly litigious.
Of course.
But then, as we've seen, they all were.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is Shakespeare's description of him. And actually it's Falstaff's description of him, so he's quite lenient on himself. Quote, "A good portly man, i' faith, and a corpulent, of a cheerful look, pleasing eye, and a noble carriage," unquote. Or a quote not by Falstaff himself, "That trunk of humours, that bolting hutch of beastliness, that swollen parcel of dropsies, that huge bombard of sack, that stuffed cloak bag of guts, that roasted Manningtree ox with the pudding in his belly, that reverend vice, that grey iniquity, that father ruffian, that vanity in years," unquote.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so he loved him. He thought he was... Okay.
Yep. And Falstaff said of honour, quote, "Can honour set a leg? No. Or an arm? No. Or take away the grief of a wound? No. Honour hath no skill in surgery then? No. What is honour? A word. What is the word honour? Air," unquote.
Lovely.
So Falstaff, fat and cowardly. That's his main attributes. So let's see how similar Fastolf is to Falstaff and why Shakespeare might have taken liberties with his name. Fastolf has been described as having fled the field at the Battle of Patay that's Patay, P-A-T-A-Y, not Patay, in 1429, abandoning his men. That was where the link with cowardice came in. We'll see how fair that was. His first appearance in Shakespeare is in Henry VI, because you didn't write them in order, where he is called Fastolf, not Falstaff.
Oh.
Captain, whither away, Sir John Fastolf, in such haste? Fastolf, whither away? To save myself by flight. We are like to have the overthrow again. Captain, what? Will you fly and leave Lord Talbot? Fastolf, aye, all the Talbots in the world, to save my life. Captain, cowardly knight, ill fortune follow thee. So he was very unfortunate that he got this reputation.
Yes.
Shakespeare got his information from Edward Hall and Raphael Hollingshead. I never know whether to say Hollinshead or Holinshed. I'll go with Hollinshead. They were proper historians, so they must be right. Holinshead wrote, quote, "From this battle departed without any stroke stricken Sir John Fastolf, the same year for his valiantness elected into the Order of the Garter. But for doubt of misdealing at this brunt, the Duke of Bedford took from him the image of St. George and his garter, though afterwards by means of friends and apparent causes of good excuse, the same were to him again delivered, against the mind of the Lord Talbot," unquote. So Fastolf was so cowardly that he was stripped of the Order of the Garter, only to get it back because he had friends in high places who put in a word for him, according to Holinshead.
So he's got a bad reputation everywhere.
Yes. Now, why should Shakespeare have gone with this rendering of events? Well, for a start, it could be true. But if it isn't, Fastolf was only gentry, and, as we saw in the Pastons episode, his lineage died out with him.
Yeah, nobody could sue him.
Nobody could sue him. Talbot, on the other hand, was nobility, and his descendants have positions in the Elizabethan court. So Fastolf didn't stand a chance, really, with a reputation. Shakespeare was going to call Falstaff Sir John Oldcastle. In fact, he started to. Oldcastle was a real man who had been a Lollard during Henry V's time.
Oh.
But the Reformation had rehabilitated some of the Lollards, including Oldcastle, so he no longer fitted the type of character Shakespeare had in mind.
Right.
And anyway, he feared a backlash from the Oldcastle family. But there was no one to talk up for Fastolf.
Mm-hmm.
There are similarities between Falstaff and Fastolf. They were both involved in recruiting soldiers, including getting soldiers drunk and whisking them off to the wars. They both drank at the Boar's Head, although Falstaff's was in Eastcheap and Fastolf's was in Southwark. They may both have been pages to the Duke of Norfolk. So it's not as if we're talking about two entirely different people.
Right.
With each rendering of the character, poor Fastolf became more and more contemptible. In the first written chronologically, in Henry VI, he was a coward. In Henry IV, he's an obese, drunken, lecherous coward. And once Falstaff appears in The Merry Wives of Windsor, all attempts at making a serious caricature have gone out the window. He's entirely played for laughs.
For some reason, I'm thinking that Queen Elizabeth asked for him to be included in another play. Was this that?
She loved him,
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
She really enjoyed him,
Yeah.
so she said, yeah, bring him back. He was a good laugh.
Yeah. And that's the only reason he came in, as that comedic.
He bumped up the comedy at that point,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, let's look at Fastolf himself. He was born in Norfolk in 1380, so that's the earliest date we've had, although he did have a very long life. His name is thought to be of Viking origin. And he was loyal to 3 Lancastrian kings, Henry's 4, 5 and 6.
Wow. Man, that must be weird. We're in our era. Queen Elizabeth was there forever.
Yeah,
It's only been one.
nobody could remember a time before her.
Yeah.
Very few people could remember a time before her. In 1392, he accompanied... That sounds like a long, long time ago, doesn't it? In 1392, he accompanied Bolingbroke, who was to become Henry IV, to Königsberg in Prussia, now Kaliningrad in Russia, then overland to Venice, then by sea to Jaffa and Jerusalem. And if it's 1392, he'd only be 12. He was probably a page at this time of the Earl of Norfolk, but he got to see a hell of a lot of the world at the age of 12. Between 1401 and 1415, Fastolf was in Ireland with one of Henry IV's sons, Thomas. And we don't know much about his movements since the Irish Record Office was destroyed by the IRA in 1922. It was in Ireland that he met his wife, Millicent. She had been the wife of the Deputy Lieutenant of Ireland, Sir Stephen Scrope, who had died of plague.
Another Scrope.
That is the father of the Stephen Scrope who complained that Fastolf had nicked all his money
Which he might have.
when he became a ward. But Millicent's maiden name had been Tiptoft.
Ooh.
So she's got a bit of the Scrope and a bit of the Tiptoft.
Yeah.
Fastolf then went to Aquitaine in the army of the Duke of Exeter. And this war was very complicated since by the time they got there, the Armagnacs had changed sides. But the beauty of doing a character that is before our time zone is that we don't have to get bogged down in that sort of thing. We just need to know where he was, and that's what he was doing at the time. When they reached Bordeaux, Fastolf was made deputy constable, but he appears not to have been paid since in 1455, many years later, he was petitioning the Crown for £26, 15 shillings and threepence, quote, whereof he has yet had neither payment nor assignment, unquote. He was then with the army as they ravaged Armagnac territory in a "we'll teach you to change sides" type way.
If that never happens. It never helps.
No. 1415, Fastolf was off again, this time with Henry V to Harfleur in Normandy, and he was in the retinue of Michael de la Pole, 2nd Earl of Suffolk. And he would later claim, Fastolf would later claim, quote, he was the first to disembark and jump into the sea up to his sword belt.
Of course he was.
And the king gave him the first house he saw in France, unquote. Which probably meant he had his hands in front of his eyes, thinking, right, I'm not
look
taking
at a
them away
nice
until
one.
I see a decent one, yeah. Although, if he had been the first, it's surprising he lived to tell the tale, since the king had announced that on pain of death, no one should disembark before he did. So, not only was Fastolf not punished, but he was knighted. And he got a motto, me faut faire, I must be doing. It's long been assumed that he had fought in Agincourt, but in fact he was invalided home 3 weeks before. So he wasn't part of the few, the happy few, the band of brothers that fought in Agincourt on St. Crispin's Day. His injuries can't have been that bad, since he was soon back in Harfleur and being besieged. And he led a foraging party who captured French prisoners. They weren't foraging for prisoners, they're not going to eat them. They were foraging for food, and they came across some prisoners. But they had to let them go after they came under attack.
I thought you were going to say once they figured out they shouldn't eat them.
They thought, a bit scrawny. Let's not bother. But I can't imagine that anyone would have been particularly happy if he had arrived back in Harfleur, not with food, but with more mouths to feed. It was very grim. William Worcester, in his Book of Noblesse, William Worcester had strong links with Fastolf, wrote, quote, a wretched cow's head was sold for 6 shillings and 8 pence sterling,
Wow.
and the tongue for 40 shillings.
Wow.
And there died of English soldiers more than 500 in default of sustenance, unquote. And Fastolf told Worcester about the siege, so that's where the information came from.
Wow.
He wasn't above making a shaggy dog story out of it, though. For instance, he elongated the length of the siege, and much of what he says about most things seemed to be bigging up his own role. In August 1415, Harfleur was relieved by the Duke of Bedford. And to cut a long story short, Henry V conquered Normandy and took it back under the English crown, and Fastolf was present at least some of the battles. Although he wasn't in the top ranks, he had been noticed by King Henry. This missive was from Henry, quote, the king to the lieutenant of our town of Harfleur, the treasurer of the town, and any other relevant officials there, greetings. Because we have been given to understand that you have caused various supplies of victuals intended for our dear and faithful John Fastolf to be arrested in the said town, having ourselves heard the arguments about the matter presented before us, we now command you to cause the said victuals to be released forthwith, or whatever kind they may be, and to be delivered to the said John, or to his angel, or to his agent, given at our royal castle of Caen in the Royal Duchy of Normandy by the king in person. So that was something for Fastolf to show his mum when he got home.
Look at this, look at this.
Yeah, he called me dear and faithful, mum. So, yeah, he seemed to be well in with the king. I mean, you wouldn't have thought necessarily the king would notice the person who was just sort of bringing the provisions.
Yeah.
Rouen was captured in 1419, and Fastolf was put in charge of garrisoning a monastery and was told to take their wages from the monastery, which sounds a bit like looting to me.
Yes, it really does. I was about to say.
Yes.
So he's just allowed to go in and get whatever he wants. You know that roof? It's lead, isn't it? That roof is lead?
He was given estates around Normandy. In 1419, John, Duke of Burgundy, was murdered. Charles, the heir to the French throne, was widely thought to be complicit in the murder, and the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, father of Charles the Bold, allied with the English. King Charles VI of France was persuaded to disinherit his own murderous son, And by the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, the English, the Burgundians and the French monarch all agreed that Henry V should become regent for Charles VI.
We had doomed France to 100 years of just misery.
Yes, yes. To seal the deal, Henry V married Catherine de Valois, who would later go on to secretly marry Owen Tudor. Mm-hmm. So there we are. It's all relevant. When Henry V entered Paris, the only time an English army had ever occupied Paris, or has ever occupied Paris, Fastolf was made keeper of the Bastille, and he promised to keep safe and not to hand over to anyone except the King of England. And he didn't. He's not like we read in the Patreon episode of Caterina Conaro, where someone was told only to hand the castle over to the Queen, and he was given a letter signed the Queen, and he said, "Oh, all right, you can have it." And then he was told not to be so damn gullible next time. In 1421, while Henry V was in England for the coronation of Catherine de Valois, Normandy fell to the Dauphin of France and the Duke of Clarence. That's not George, that's an earlier one, I presume. Otherwise, George would have been quite old.
He's my grandfather and my brother. What?
Normandy fell to the Dauphin of France, and the Duke of Clarence, heir to the English throne, was killed. Then the following year, Fastolf was with Henry at the siege of Meaux, when the king caught dysentery and died. Then a few months later, Charles VI of France died. So who was now the King of France? The 9-month-old Henry VI. People in France were having second thoughts about that Treaty of Troyes. Little Henry's uncle, John Duke of Bedford, quickly became regent of France. In Shakespeare, Bedford distrusts Falstaff, but the real Fastolf worked very closely with Bedford.
Oh gosh, that's going to be confusing in a bit. Falstaff, yes. Fastolf.
Although he was on Bedford's wedding list, but was crossed out, and we're not sure why.
Oh, he did him a bad. Sorry, that's horrible.
Or he just discovered, oh, hang on, I've got more than she has.
Yeah.
I'll knock a few off mine and she can add a few. Bedford was the first regent in English history with vice-regal powers in France. And Fastolf was one of the most powerful men at his court, with a ludicrous number of titles, including Grand Master. Although back in England, he didn't have much in the way of power or influence at all. His sphere of influence is very much France.
Yeah, it sounded weird because otherwise he would have had, there would have been a bigger impact for the Paston family. So I was getting confused. How could he be this powerful and yet, yeah.
He retires, but we'll see. He retires back to England, but he spends a lot of time in France.
Okay.
And maybe that's why he did so well in France, because it's quite hard to recruit people who would take on the positions of responsibility in France. Mm-hmm. People preferred to remain near the English court, where proximity to the king might mean preferment.
And their own lands.
Yeah. Fastolf became a banneret, which meant he could lead troops. And then in 1426, he was elected Knight of the Garter. Edward III had founded the order, quote, as a token of respect, to show that when he was engaged in battle, he would not leave the field, but would stay to await whatever fortune it might please God to send, unquote. And this was obviously to come back and bite Falstaff on the bottom 3 years later, when he was accused of leaving the field.
Oh.
I mean, that is the sole reason for getting it initially, whereas obviously later, when people like Margaret Beaufort got it,
yeah,
leaving the field was not as relevant.
Yeah. Interesting. I've never really looked into the Order of the Garter, so I didn't realize it meant that you don't run.
Yeah. No, you hang on in there. You stay to the bitter end, Fastolf. In 1431, Henry VI came to France for his coronation, the only English king to be crowned in both England and France. And actually, when we refer to English military successes and English territory, we should rightly say Anglo-Burgundian, since they were very much a team at this point. Sir John Talbot was then shipped over to France, and he was a much more experienced soldier than Fastolf, and he completely overshadowed him. And you don't want that.
No.
You're the big fish over there. But someone comes along and does the job so well that people start to wonder why they've put up with your rank amateurishness all this time. And they had to decide which way to take this war. Bedford and Fastolf were in favour of plugging away at Maine and Anjou, since Fastolf now had land there, and he obviously was quite keen to protect it. The Earl of Salisbury and Talbot said no, let's besiege Orleans. And that's what they went with, because, well, he's an earl. So.
Yep. I outrank you.
Yeah, and it all started out so well. They captured Janville, and they decided to use that as their base, so they left much of their firepower, their cannons, munitions, general equipment there. So that was a nice little windfall for the French when they took it back again a little while later. The English systematically took fortresses in the area until they had Orleans surrounded. And where there weren't forts to capture, they built them. So far, so good. But then the Earl of Salisbury was shot in the head with a cannonball.
Oh!
But surprisingly, it took him 8 days to die.
Oh, that's even worse. I thought, that would be brutal, but it would be done instantly. 8 days.
I assumed his head would go up like a melon.
Yeah.
No, apparently not. Well, if it did, he carried on living for 8 days.
And why didn't people put him out of his misery? You have to see that that's not going to be possible to recover.
I'm trying to think of the name of the Roman emperor who started his emperorship with most of his head severed from his body.
What?
Strachius, something like that. Yes, his dad had been killed in the war. He had been almost beheaded, and that was it. That was his reign. He survived for a couple of months, I think.
Ugh.
Yes. It's on Totalus Rankium, if people want to listen.
It's been a while since I've listened to them.
It's quite funny in a very morbid way.
Yeah. It's been a while since I listened to their older episodes.
The Burgundians had had enough partway through the siege and had gone home. To prevent desertion, the English raised the pay of their soldiers, and Fastolf was sent to Paris to get provisions. So, Paris sounds nice. I've had vision of him coming back with croissants and camembert and baguettes and nice few bottles of wine. What he did come back, though, with is barrels of herring, since Lent was approaching.
Ah.
He also had 1,200 men and, quote, victuals, bombards, cannons, powder, missiles and other war materials, unquote. So something to replace all the stuff they rather stupidly left in that castle. He'd had an eventful trip. When they set off on the return journey from Paris, while crossing the Beauce, the convoy was attacked by the French. And it was there that Fastolf won his greatest victory in what became known as the Battle of the Herrings. While this was going on, the English had lifted the siege of Orleans and left, abandoning their stuff. Well, why would they do this? Why would you lift a siege? Well, the short answer is that Joan of Arc had turned up.
Right, we're at that time.
Joan of Arc knew about Fastolf, the man who was bringing the herrings for everyone. She was at dinner when a message arrived, quote, after dinner, my Lord Dunois came to the maid's lodging, where she and I had dined together. While he was talking to her, my lord told her that he had heard for certain on good authority that one Fastolf, who was one of the enemy's captains, was soon to arrive in the enemy's camp, both to bring them succour and to reinforce their host, as well as to re-victual them, and that even now he was at Janville. The maid was highly delighted with this news, or so it seemed to me, and spoke the following words to my Lord Dunois, or something similar. Bastard, bastard! That's her being delighted? In the name of God, I command you to let me know as soon as you hear of Fastolf's coming. For if he gets through without my knowing it, I swear to you I will have your head cut off.
Wow, she was pleasant.
Feisty, to which my Lord Dunois answered that he did not doubt it, and that he would certainly keep her informed, unquote. So it seems interesting. We've seen Fastolf as a man living in Norfolk,
quietly,
just doing up his castle. Yes,
yes.
And he was known by Joan of Arc. Later, the story continues, quote, when I was beginning to doze, the maid suddenly jumped up out of bed, I don't know what she was doing in bed with him, and woke me with great noise she made. And when I asked her what the matter was, she replied, "In God's name, my mission is to march against the English, but I do not know if I must go against their forts or against for Fastolf." I don't know why she keeps giving him 2 Fs. "Who is to resupply them?" Thereupon I got up and armed the maid as quickly as I could, unquote. And apparently she told Fastolf to take the English army and leave France. And he wasn't very polite about it. So I don't know what he said, but she was obviously miffed enough to decide to take the English down after that point.
Oops.
And it can't be denied that things had been going very well for England before she arrived. And after that, it was complete disaster.
I'm very surprised. In my head, the Maid of France was quiet. Well, I guess not quiet, but she wasn't cursing at people.
And telling them they'd have their heads cut off if they didn't do as they were told.
Yeah.
The French chronicler, Percival de Cagny, wrote, quote, "On Sunday 8th of May, the Lords Fastolf, Willoughby, Scales and other captains," so there's lots of names there that pop up in our period, "who were in the forts on the French north side, had seen the attack from a distance which the Maid had launched on the Wednesday against the Bastille Saint-Lô, and that she had taken it and killed those inside. And they had seen the attacks she made on the Saturday against the Tourelle and on the Bastille on the bridge. On this Sunday, then, in the morning, they set fire to their lodgings and made off, most of them on foot, towards Meung and Beaugency. And it was in this way that the noble city of Orleans was freed by the Maid, the messenger of God," unquote. So Fastolf had run away from a girl. And he wasn't alone. The whole army had fled. Fastolf had asked a man called Basset to write a chronicle for him. And is it a coincidence that it stops just before the siege of Orleans? But the French chroniclers definitely do not stop at that point. And now we get to the Battle of Patay, which was to be Fastolf's downfall. There was a general rout of the English. The French ran them to earth at Patay, not far from where Fastolf had won his Battle of the Herrings. The English were outnumbered and they were out in the open. Fastolf was all for retreating and coming back to fight another day. Talbot, who I see as more like flash art, I think, was all for getting in there straight away. He said that it was just him and his men he would still, quote, "go and fight in the cause of God and St. George," unquote. Fastolf felt it was a big mistake, but he went along with it. And it was a big mistake. Talbot was taken prisoner. Quote, "Then Sir John Fastolf, seeing the danger in flight itself, but knowing that everything was going very badly, said to me directly that I should take care of myself because the battle was lost, and that in any case he wanted to return to the fray and await its outcome there, according to whatever God might ordain for him, and said that he would rather die or be captured than flee dishonourably and abandon his countrymen," unquote. But he was convinced by others that that would be suicidal. The battle was already lost. But when he reached Paris, quote, "he was the subject of bitter reproaches, and it was for this that the Order of the Garter was taken away." But afterwards, when various accounts were given of the way in which he had argued with his companions, and when many other reasonable arguments for his conduct, for which there was good evidence, were deployed, the Garter was given back to him, though I know there was great dispute between him and the Lord Talbot when the latter returned from imprisonment he had been subjected to since the day of the aforesaid battle, unquote. So it's a slightly different story than the one we were told by Holinshead. It's not that he had friends in high places, it was that people who were in high places, admittedly, said, no, honestly, he wanted to go back and fight. We talked him out of it. But when Talbot got back, yeah, you can see it from Talbot's point of view. He's been in prison all this time. And Fastolf, who'd left the field, got to live his life.
Yeah.
And it was the Duke of Bedford who suspended Fastolf's Order of the Garter. But that wasn't because he was punishing him. It was more that with all the complaints around, he felt he had to be seen to be doing something. But it must have been horrendous for Fastolf. As a Knighter of the Garter, he would have been seen as very much the chivalric type.
Yeah.
So an accusation of cowardice would have been the very worst thing. Well, apart from being in prison all that time, I suppose.
Yeah, but
Like Talbot was.
lots of people, it turns out, ended up in prison for something or other. But the cowardice thing is going to follow you for the rest of your life.
Yes, yeah. When Talbot came back, he gained all the accolades. He became known as the English Achilles.
Oh, no.
And it was his version of events which became the accepted one, certainly by William Shakespeare. And poor Fastolf was never allowed to forget it. And he was the subject of a play. He seems to be subject to lots of plays, but this one's a French one called Le Mystère du Siège, or The Play of the Siege. And this time he was known as Jahan Facetot. This event was portrayed very favourably in Le Mystère du Siège, a lot more favourably than he was treated in Shakespeare. The English Parliament told Bedford and Gloucester to sue for peace, and Fastolf was given the task as ambassador for negotiating the peace. But why Fastolf? He was on Bedford's council and he had had some experience in negotiation. He wasn't alone, but the other two ambassadors were professional diplomats. I wondered if it was a punishment, since suing for peace was from a losing position is pretty humiliating.
Yes.
So you fled the field, now you can pick up the pieces. But maybe it was just because he'd been in France a while. He knew the ropes.
Me? I don't know.
The talks were at a stalemate pretty much as soon as they started. The French wanted the prisoners taken at Agincourt released, so they could join in the negotiations. England said no. The English asked for territorial concessions. The French said no. So that was that for 3 years. No, right, okay. When it was reconvened, Bedford was too ill to attend, so he authorised Fastolf to submit a memorandum containing the stand to take on all issues. First of all, Henry VI's right to the French crown was not up for grabs. If they did give up this claim, then all the wars that had gone on before would be England tyrannically trying to grab land to which they had no entitlement, so they had to cling on to this idea that they should have the French crown. Not all the advice came from Bedford. Much of it was Fastolf himself, and it became a treatise on warfare, including his plan to bring the Valois to its knees by the English troops fanning out like the police searching for a body and, quote, burning and destroying all the land as they pass, both houses, corn, vines, and all trees that bear fruit for man's sustenance, and all beasts that may not be driven should be destroyed, and all that can be spared over and above the needs of the host should be driven to Normandy, to Paris, and other regions in the king's obedience.
So, complete and utter devastation.
Complete devastation.
Nothing left behind.
Yeah, that's what Falstaff recommends.
Okay.
Yeah. 3 years of that, Fastolf reckoned ought to do the trick. Whether he was a coward or not is debatable, but I think what's pretty definite, he's not a very nice person.
Well, I don't think there is anybody in war who's nice.
No.
But still.
This went against the idea that French non-combatants should be treated as if they were English subjects. And they were entitled to protection from the crown. But Fastolf got around this by implying that they deserved everything they got because they wouldn't submit to Henry. For Fastolf, this would be a just war, since the difference between a just and unjust war relied on the legitimacy of the ruler. Henry VI is legitimate, so anything goes.
Right.
This would be a complete reversal of the strategy favoured by Henry V and Bedford since 1417. They favoured siege warfare, employed during the conquest of Normandy, because siege warfare, you're fighting soldier for soldier, effectively. But this was to be abandoned, and civilians would be at risk. And Fastolf was advocating a return to the strategy pursued by Edward III, when the emphasis had been on the sending of expeditions. Edward III and the Black Prince had ridden across France, just pillaging and decimating the countryside with wild abandon. Luckily for the good Valois folk, Fastolf's advice was not taken. The negotiations faltered and the English walked out. Philip the Good of Burgundy didn't, though. He got his lawyers to check the lawfulness of that Treaty of Troyes, and they found out that, surprise, surprise, it wasn't lawful at all. So he was quite free to ditch the English and side with the French, for a small consideration. And that was Picardy and a few important cities in the Somme. Back in England, Philip the Good was not popular. And the houses, well, obviously they couldn't get to Philip the Good, but the houses of the Flemish merchants were sacked and burnt. And it was a free-for-all in the English Channel, with Burgundian ships the target of pirates.
Gosh, so glad I do not live during that time period.
And we haven't even got to the War of the Roses yet. In 1434, Fastolf rescued the city of Caen when a large group of peasants surrounded it. And I don't think it should particularly lessen his achievement that he was leading trade soldiers and his opponents were untrained peasants. But that didn't stem the tide. The French were taking over English strongholds all over the place. Panic was setting in. One commander, Appleton, asked Fastolf to look after his widowed daughter. So obviously the people didn't think they were going to survive this. So they were telling people to look after their family. In 1435, Fastolf found buried treasure. And this had been found buried in the cathedral city of Sées, and it was found in the bishop's palace, so you would assume it belonged to the bishop.
Yes.
Fastolf thought otherwise and took it, and his argument being that the bishop was loyal to Charles VII, and so it was enemy property. He didn't keep it for himself, he handed it over to Bedford.
Mm-hmm.
And this was to have disastrous ramifications for Fastolf later. So all this was going on when back at home in England there was discontent as they saw what they considered their birthright being taken over by the French. The intention had been to take Normandy and fill it with English settlers. There'd be an English militia to look after the place as well as French loyal to Henry VI. But it didn't work that way. The settlers mostly just didn't turn up. The French was not as loyal as they hoped they would be, and you can understand that. You can't just bring in English settlers without displacing people. And there are abuses, including a woman, Joan the Bold, who was buried alive for sheltering rebels. So the English were becoming less and less popular for some reason.
Oh yeah, couldn't imagine why.
Later, Fastolf would brood on these atrocities. William Worcester's Book of Noblesse contained an exclamation by him against the oppressions and tyrannies and cruelties against the poor commons, labourers and peasants. He said that they had been, quote, surcharged grievously with the payment of taxes, tails, subsidies and impositions besides their rent, unquote. So Fastolf, for one, was not that surprised that they'd revolted. When Bedford died, Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York and father to Edward IV, Richard III and Margaret of Burgundy, took over. And George.
George, yes. Don't forget George.
But he was lieutenant, not regent. That's how much it had all changed. And things were not so great for Fastolf. He'd worked closely with Bedford for years. But the Duke of York had his own people. He kept Fastolf on as an advisor, but several of his posts, including Grand Master, went to other people.
Isn't that crazy how your life can change in such a short period of time? Just because somebody else is in charge.
Just who you know.
Yeah.
And Talbot was part of the York team, and he still had a grudge against Fastolf.
Of course he did.
Apparently abandoning him. Fastolf was again part of the team that would negotiate peace along with the Duke of York. But why would the French want peace? They were trampling all over English forces. They didn't need to make concessions. The following year, 1437, York was replaced by the Earl of Warwick. And that shouldn't have been a problem in itself, but he was Talbot's father-in-law. And I had to chase up the family tree. I believe he was also Warwick the Kingmaker's father-in-law. I think that's right. In 1437, Fastolf left France and was made Lieutenant General of the Channel Islands. I don't know if that's a demotion.
I don't know either.
He was very keen that the navy should be maintained. Unfortunately, Henry VI wasn't.
Henry VI wasn't about anything.
No. I'm not quite sure whether anybody asked him, really. They didn't ask him much, did they?
No, Somerset's in charge, isn't he?
Yes, I think so at this point. But this meant that England became reliant on what can only be described as pirates. But Fastolf invested in one such venture to the tune of £100. This idea presumably being that he should see a return on his investments in the form of loot. However, the captain of the ship called a Hanseatic ship to lower their flags in the presence of an English ship, and they told him to do something scatological, shall we say.
Oh.
And the English captain attacked, and there were casualties on both sides, and Fastolf never saw his £100 again.
That's what you get for being with pirates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to invest in something, don't invest in pirates.
No.
In 1439, Fastolf was back in England. He was 59 and he'd done enough fighting.
That's actually fairly late to still be fighting.
Well, I think that's what he did. Mm-hmm. That was what he knew, really, wasn't it? Back in France, the French government were rent with factions, largely due to a certain devious Dauphin, who would later become that universal spider, Louis XI. Mm-hmm. Fastolf was living in Southwark, frequenting the Boar's Head. William Worcester complains that he spent 13 years gathering evidence to prove that his master did not flee the battlefield at Patay. He got testaments from the King and the Duke of Gloucester.
Yeah, see how important that is to somebody's reputation? They have to fight that.
They have to. It wasn't until 1442 that the case was finally concluded and Fastolf was reinstated in the Order of the Garter. It's a long time to have that accusation hanging over you.
Yeah.
Throughout the 1440s, he bombarded the government with advice on how to govern France.
Let me tell you how to do your job.
Yes.
That's always popular.
Ignore the peaceniks, he said. The Duke of Somerset was all for giving concessions to the French for peace. The Duke of Gloucester was dead against it. Henry VI decided to release the Duke of Orleans, who'd been a prisoner in England for 25 years since the Battle of Agincourt. And the thinking behind that was the French would gather around Orleans and he would be able to convince them to make concessions, not given how well treated he'd been in England and all that. Fastolf was dead against this move. Orleans was a useful bargaining chip. As far as he was concerned, Henry had just handed him over to the French without any benefit to England whatsoever.
I tend to agree.
Yes, well, the infuriating thing about Fastolf is he tends to be right. Mm-hmm. The Earl of Suffolk began a series of negotiations in France, in which Charles VII and his brother-in-law René of Anjou made a laughingstock of the English negotiators. But it was agreed that Henry VI should marry René's daughter, Margaret of Anjou, and a two-year truce was negotiated at Tours in 1445. Henry also agreed that the region of Maine should be taken back to the House of Anjou. And this will have been a bit of a blow for Fastolf, since that was where his French territories were, what was left of them. Mm-hmm. Also, the English settlers in Maine had been left to their fate, because we heard before of bedraggled masses trying to get back to England, right, having been left in the lurch by Somerset and Henry. These were those bedraggled masses. Mm.
And it's not like the French coming in are going to be kind to you at all.
Some of the English knights living in Maine demanded compensation, and one of those knights was a Dobney.
Oh!
Talking of names that carry on. No compensation was ever paid to the English settlers, though. While the settlers might have been out of pocket, the Duke of Somerset had done very nicely. Despite how Falstaff had been, as he felt, cheated out of compensation, he continued to advise Somerset about military matters, and he also warned him to be careful. There were plenty of people out there who had reasons to dislike Somerset intensely.
Yep.
I think Fastolf is one of these people who's so sure of his own opinions that he doesn't mind which side he tells. He's not siding with anybody necessarily, he's just telling them how to do it. In 1447, officers of the Duke of Suffolk had occupied two of Fastolf's manors at Dedham in Essex. Suffolk claimed that these properties were his, and yet with no basis of fact. And yet Fastolf was quite unable to obtain any redress from the courts in the following 3 years.
Well, the courts in England were kind of in a shambles themselves.
They were. It might have been because Suffolk was such a powerful man, or was it because with this taint of cowardice hanging over him?
Yeah, people don't trust. Yeah.
Didn't have that much sympathy for him. It was only after Suffolk was beheaded in an extrajudicial execution on board a ship crossing the Channel in 1450 that Fastolf was finally able to obtain justice. And this is the father of John de la Pole that we heard about terrorising Margaret Paston last time.
Yes.
Then in 1449, a new bishop of Sées sued Fastolf over that buried treasure, resulting in all Fastolf's property in Normandy being, quote, put into the hand of justice, unquote.
I don't know why I feel bad for him.
And this included his, quote, goods, heritages, rents and revenues, unquote. He'd hoped to be backed up by Henry VI and his officers, but he was just hung out to dry, really. By this time, Henry was keen to keep the French sweet, so Fastolf's argument that he took the treasure not for himself, but for the English crown, was ignored, and he was bitter about it.
Yeah.
So look on the bright side. In 1450, Normandy fell to the French, so Fastolf wouldn't have been able to claim his Norman properties anyway. And it turns out that England lost France because the French cheated. William Worcester said, quote, of which duchy we have in the year of our Lord 1450 lost, as within the space of 15 months put out wrongfully through subtle workings conspired and wrought by the French party under the shadow and colour of a truce, unquote. So not our fault at all.
No.
Apparently.
No, it's never our
They
fault.
cheated by creating a standing army. We heard about that in Charles VIII episode, that they had this standing army. But even at these last hours before Normandy fell, or was liberated by the French, whichever way you want to see it, Fastolf was sending advice to the king, although we don't know whether Henry ever saw it. His advice this time was that 40,000 troops needed to be raised, 10,000 for Aquitaine and 30,000 for Normandy, and these troops would sweep across the country as far south as Languedoc. So, similar thing, sweep across the country, devastate the whole thing. Bish, bash, bosh. But this sounds like an old soldier trying to capture the glories of his youth, I felt.
It does, yeah.
It was seen as sheer fantasy. His argument was that the French would never be satisfied with Normandy. Give them an inch and they'd take a mile, and that mile would be in England. So he was warning of potential invasion. And this wasn't taken seriously. It was obvious he was out of kilter with the other advisers. On the 19th of August 1450, John Paston's agent in London reported that, quote, this Wednesday it was told that Cherbourg is gone, and we have now not a foot of land in Normandy, and men are afraid that Calais will very soon be besieged, unquote. So it's pretty much all over for France now.
Well, not France, England.
Well, yes, England in France.
Right.
No, France is doing all right. The previous year, a pamphlet was published called Suggestions for Questions to be Asked of the Duke of Somerset Respecting His Misconduct in Normandy. And this stems from the botched raid on Fougères.
Mm-hmm.
I looked that up on Wikipedia, on there, because Fougères has got a Wikipedia page, and I thought I'd get more details about it, but it was barely mentioned, because it turns out that poor Fougères was constantly being besieged.
Oh.
So this one wasn't anything special. Anyway, this pamphlet was anonymous, and no one knows who wrote it, although it has many similarities to other writings of Fastolf. And he was known to have felt that Somerset just made a mess of it all. Suspiciously so, he thought.
Oh, he
was there more to it than just incompetence?
Right.
Among the suggested questions in this pamphlet were, how much did the Duke of Somerset make out of the raid on Fougères? Why had the duchy been left so unprepared on what turned out to be the eve of the French invasion? Why had Somerset ransomed and pillaged his own officers? Why did he leave the fortress without artillery and stores? What repairs had he made to fortifications? Why had he not made sure that the garrison troops had received their wages? So, if it was Fastolf who wrote this, and it sounds pretty much like it, he wasn't pulling his punches.
No. You did everything wrong. I want to know why.
Yes. Yes, he's insinuating that money intended for the settlers in Maine had been diverted into Somerset's own
Pocket.
money bags.
Yeah.
People were even more infuriated because plenty of people had lost land in France, including Fastolf, with no compensation at all. Somerset, who was the cause of this disaster, was appointed Constable of England and Captain of Calais, so he was doing all right.
That's not going to go well for him, though.
And it's not going to go well for Henry VI.
No.
Because it just doesn't look good. Fastolf was getting on at this time, and he had the old general's disappointment in the youth of today, who he said would rather be lawyers than soldiers. Although, obviously, he did make use of lawyers a fair bit, including John Paston.
Yeah, I was about to say.
There was unrest in England. People felt they had been let down by their leaders. Henry had to send the Duke of Suffolk away for his own protection, which obviously backfired, since, as we say, he was beheaded on his way to France.
Yep.
And then, in 1450, a full-scale rebellion broke up, led by Jack Cade. Many people had sympathy with Cade until it all got a tad too violent. And I'm sure Fastolf would have agreed with much of their disenchantment, but it didn't stop them raiding Fastolf's place in Southwark and kidnapping his servant John Payne. Fastolf had placed, quote, old soldiers of Normandy, unquote, in his house as protection. Unfortunately, he then sent poor Payne out to find out what was going on, and Payne was taken to Cade, where someone pointed out that he was one of Fastolf's men.
Oh, no.
Cade said that he was sent, quote, by the greatest traitor that was in England and in France, one Sir John Fastolf, knight, who had diminished all the garrisons of Normandy and Le Mans and Maine, and had caused the king to lose all his title and right of inheritance that he had beyond the sea, unquote, which wasn't really fair.
No, not fair.
Fastolf had been just as annoyed about it as Cade was.
Yeah.
Cade's men threatened to execute Payne, but he was saved by Master Poynings.
Oh.
Presumably the one we heard in Margaret Paston's episode, who married poor Elizabeth Paston, who'd been kept prisoner by her mother Agnes.
Yeah. Oh, it's horrible.
He was told to go back to Southwark. Payne was told to go back to Southwark, tell Fastolf their list of grievances, and then get as much equipment as he could, and then come back and join them. Payne did go back, but instead he advised Fastolf to abandon his house, tell his soldiers to stand down, and go for safety to the tower. Meanwhile, Payne, who seems to be a phenomenally brave person, stayed and actually fed and watered Cade's men.
That sounds like they're dogs. Give them their food and water.
Yes, have they had their feed? They did ransack the place, but Payne being there probably prevented it being burnt to the ground. And I really hope Fastolf was grateful. But I'm not sure he was, since we hear Payne's side of the story from his request to Fastolf's executors after Fastolf's death, asking to be reimbursed for the money he spent feeding these people. So this poor bloke has just saved Fastolf's house, and Fastolf doesn't even occur to him to give him money for it. But this does fit in with the view of Fastolf we get from his stepson.
Yes.
And we know the list of grievances since the actual copy still exists.
Ooh.
There is nothing in it that Fastolf would have contradicted. If it hadn't been for the violence, and if they hadn't ransacked his house, maybe Fastolf would have been on the same side as Cade.
You think?
Could have been. I mean, he certainly agreed with him more than he agreed with Somerset.
Yeah.
And if you get someone like Poynings, I mean, they're not all peasants.
No.
There was constant fear the French would attack. In 1456, and Fastolf is now 76, he was appointed to a commission whose remit was to ensure that the watchers of the Suffolk coast, quote, kept such watches to resist invasion by the king's enemies, unquote. The following year, he was one of those responsible for the defence of Great Yarmouth and other local ports. Fastolf had become wealthy, partly through his marriage into the Scrope-Tiptoft family, but largely through the profits of war. Not just spoils, he was also a paid soldier, although only intermittently. Nobody gets paid the full amount they're entitled to, do they? He sometimes had to wait up to 20 years for his money.
20 years?
20 years, yes. Mind you, poor de Puebla.
Yes, didn't. Ever.
Never saw his money. But also, what was making Fastolf so rich was ransom money. He did very nicely out of the Duke of Alençon, for instance.
Right.
He was wealthy even though he'd lost those lands in Normandy and name. And in fact, and I tried to look up to find out who else was on this, but he is in the Sunday Times all-time richest men list.
Fastolf is.
Fastolf is.
How?
I wanted to see whether I thought Jakob
Fugger. Yeah.
surely would be in it as well, but I couldn't find the list. Yeah, so we can now see why John Paston was so keen to get his hands on that inheritance.
No kidding.
It was an enormous amount of money. Fastolf rebuilt Caister Castle. I think it was just called Caister House to start with, and he oomphed it up to a castle. And it looked more like a fortress with crenellations and a moat.
Okay.
And it now houses a motor museum, apparently. Maybe he felt more at home in fortresses.
Or maybe he had an inkling of what was going to happen.
Yeah. It was made of brick, not stone, which is quite rare. In 1458, he moved from Southwark to Caister, and we have his inventory, so we know it was pretty luxurious. Even the cook slept under a coverlet decorated with roses and bloodhounds.
Wow. I wonder if the cook also had a bed? Because they don't usually. They slept on the floor in the kitchen. Interesting.
Well, you wouldn't make the cover that
Nice to be on the ground.
fancy if you'd been, if we're amongst all the cinders.
That's why I'm thinking he would have had a chamber and a bed. Maybe. The head cook would have had a chamber. It was all the pot boys and the spit boys that would have slept on the floor there.
Yeah, the spit boys would.
But still, would he have had a bed? Beds were really luxuries.
Don't know.
Me either.
Don't know. We'll have to hone in on one house and look at how it all gets run.
Yeah.
Fastolf was an old man, and he often complained about his health, so perhaps he found Caister more conducive than Southwark. I can't imagine Southwark was very good for your health.
Why?
Well, it's city.
Oh, yes.
It's just outside the city, actually, wasn't it? But it was pretty. I should imagine you wouldn't walk home alone.
No.
He made the village of Caister into a thriving cloth manufacturing region. And some of its inhabitants, although they'd been born into a villain family, died quite rich because of it. So I'm sure the good people of Caister probably very fond of him. He lent money to Henry VI, which implies a continued devotion to duty, especially when considering that by 1455 none of the money had been paid.
Yeah.
But one thing that Fastolf does have in common with Shakespeare's Falstaff was that he was a great litigant, both in France and England. He nearly always had some case or other going on somewhere, and many of them dragged on for years.
Hence John Paston, the lawyer.
Well, yes, but he was a terrible man to work for. As many as half the people he employed ended up being thrown into prison for debt.
Oh.
His servants had a lot to say about him after his death, and none of it favourable. It's possible he was no more litigious than others of his ranks, as we heard in the Pastons, and it may be skewed by the fact that we have so much documentation about him. For instance, we know that he must have been a nightmare to have as a client, since he always thought he knew best.
Oh dear.
And constantly badgered the lawyers. You should be doing this. Why have you done that? Yeah. And he was dishonest in his litigation. Again, he was probably not alone in that, but he talks all the time of, quote, labouring the jury. In other words, interfering in the selection process.
Oh.
He wrote to a judge, quote, "The parson, Sir Thomas, is about to come up before you and the other royal judges as the cruel and hasty suit of Andrews and his affinity. But I trust to God that by your good help these proceedings, which that have been commenced so eagerly by him, will be seen for what they are, and that perjury, which is so prevalent nowadays, will be duly punished," unquote. But that doesn't stop him constantly complaining about others who are influencing the judge and jury. In fact, he complained that the Duke of Suffolk treated East Anglia as his own fiefdom. He seems to have acted in that area as Henry Bodrigan acted in Cornwall, when we said it was like the mafiosi. Many people complained about Suffolk, including the Pastons, as we heard. Fastolf found that very few of the litigations he brought against Suffolk went his way.
Well, yeah, you're going up against somebody powerful.
And Suffolk was influencing the judge and jury, and Fastolf was furious about
But
it.
Fastolf was doing the same thing.
Yes, but he wasn't winning this time.
Ugh.
After Suffolk's murder, or execution, or whatever you want to call it, his wife, Alice Chaucer, took over and was just as bad. Fastolf despaired of ever getting justice in East Anglia, and by justice obviously meant
My own
cases.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing about Fastolf, though, although he had plenty of men and weaponry, he never used violence to bring a case to a satisfactory conclusion, and many did, as we know full well. He had no children, and his wife had died in 1445, so what to do with his money?
And his stepson's money.
And his stepson's money, yes. He was very keen. You wouldn't have thought he'd need his stepson's money, would you? I mean,
No.
he's this rich. He was very keen to found a chantry college in Caister, but this was a complicated legal procedure. Luckily, his neighbour and good friend John Paston was able to help him with this. The chantry college would go some way to alleviating the terrible suffering that Fastolf expected to experience in purgatory. And I was wondering, was that a normal fear for the time, or had he done something he especially felt deserved punishment?
No, that was normal.
I know it's normal to a point, but I wonder if he was thinking of some, I don't know, his life as a soldier in general, or something specific. I mean, we heard that poor woman got buried alive just for sheltering rebels.
Oh, God.
And until we do John Paston's episode, we can't be sure, did he ever get his chantry? Or did John Paston just pocket the money for that?
Oh, yeah.
We will find out.
Or did he claim that all of it had been gone on legal proceedings and so he couldn't afford to do it?
Yeah, well, you sort of forget about the Wars of the Roses because he's so busy fighting the war in France. But he was 75 by the time of the First Battle of St Albans. And he hadn't always seen eye to eye with Henry VI. But he hadn't always seen eye to eye with the Duke of York either. In fact, I think he's one of those irascible old soldiers who don't see eye to eye with anybody. It's hard to say which side he'd have been on in the Wars of the Roses. He had more in common with York. But whether he could have gone against the king, I don't know. It seems he did plan a trip to see the king when Henry was on an Oyer and Terminate tour, presumably one of the ones he did with Tiptoft. In fact, Fastolf hadn't been well enough to undertake this trip, so it has been speculated that he wanted to assure the king of his loyalty. Accusations of treason were flying all over the place. Sometimes guilt by association could be enough. And some of the people that Fastolf had been associated with had been attainted. He was required to enter into a recognizance for good behaviour to £1,000. But he went before the council and pleaded his case, and the recognizance was withdrawn. Now, you can't imagine that in Dudley and Empson's day.
No, not at all.
So he obviously managed to convince them he was entirely loyal to the king. There is a report about the First Battle of St Albans called the Fastolf Relation, which was written by his herald, Fastolf Pursuivant. And the most remarkable thing about this document is how even-handed it is. Most writing of the time is very partisan, but this is almost a modern reporting of events. Although it's a bit like Bernard Andre type history, in that it doesn't describe the fighting at all, but it's very keen on the verbal skirmishes that went on. And then he said, so I said.
Yeah, this is verbatim.
5th of November 1459, Fastolf died of hectic fever, which is apparently a term still used for intermittent fever with large swings of temperature.
Oh.
He died in his bed, despite Joan of Arc's threats that all the English commanders would all die horrible deaths. I mean, maybe the fever was horrible.
Yeah.
But he was one day off his 80th birthday.
Wow.
One of Fastolf's great legacies was that he commissioned Peter Bassett to write a history of the French wars, and it's an insider's account with information from people who fought there. I don't know if it's entirely accurate. I don't know of a history book that is entirely accurate. And if he come to the conclusion that losing the French territory was all Fastolf's fault, maybe the book would never have seen the light of day. But it is a very useful resource for historians of that period, and it was commissioned by Fastolf. His other legacy is obviously one he'd been none too pleased about if he'd known. He's the fat, drunken lecher who hangs about at Mistress Quickly's inn at Eastcheap, bragging about his exploits and leading Prince Hal astray.
Oh dear, he would have been in court so quickly. I am suing you for slander.
I got the impression that Shakespeare took the character of Oldcastle and the name and reputation of cowardice from Fastolf.
And made them one person.
Yeah.
Okay.
The book I read was called The Real Falstaff, but I couldn't see a lot of Falstaff in Fastolf, really. I mean, I don't know whether he was very large and liked to drink. Maybe he was. I didn't like the man, but I do feel he was maligned by Shakespeare. And in such a way, I feel he would have been absolutely livid about.
Yeah. Like I said, I think he would have taken Shakespeare to court.
I think I've got written here, he would definitely have taken Shakespeare to court. And I think this time, he'd probably have won.
Yeah.
So that is the life and times of Mr. Fastolf.
Not a nice man.
Not a nice man, but he did see an awful lot of what was going on just before the period we've already looked at with the Wars of the Roses. And so an interesting character to see it through,
Yes.
I thought. And we also got to go back to Norfolk and link it with bits we've already seen.
Interesting. One of the richest men in the world.
Yes, I was amazed at that. I googled it earlier and it kept telling me who was the richest this year. And I thought, no, I don't know. I've never heard of these people, for one thing.
Yeah.
But I wanted to find the one from all times, but just had to rely on the book I read about him, that's what it said.
Wow.
I mean, that's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Of all time.
Yeah. And yet he didn't pay anybody. That's why he was the richest of all time. He didn't pay
There you
anybody.
go. I mean, I don't know, that must be England. I mean, we can't be talking about China and India and places like that, surely. That must be England. So, thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.
And see you next time.
Bye.
Goodbye.